We're going to get started with our second talk. It's going to be on courtship. So, Brad, if you want to get us started again. Dr. Wilcox.
So some of you know me and my wife, Danielle, way back. And I want to be very clear here to say that some of the things I'm going to recommend for young adults who are kind of thinking about marriage or who are aiming for marriage, who have discerned a vocation to marriage, I want to be very clear here that Danielle and I didn't necessarily do everything prior to getting married that I'm going to basically talk about today. It's sort of like the doctor, outside the hospital emergency room who's lighting up that cigarette. Sort of the sociologist who hasn't necessarily done everything that he knows is good for him. But today in our culture, I think parents, professors, and peers encourage young adults oftentimes to focus on education, to focus on their vocational future, their work, but often to the neglect of thinking much about preparing for a future when it comes to marriage and family. And so given this kind of focus that our culture tends to sort of foist upon our teenagers and our young adults, I think it's important to think about, well, how do education and work stack up to marriage and family life and predicting meaning, purpose, and happiness? And so just one way of kind of thinking about this is to look at the association in this case, the General Social Survey, between education, income, and marital status. And we can see is that Americans, adults who are college educated, are more likely to say that they're very happy here, and that adults who are earning more are more likely to say that they're very happy. So there's certainly a link when it comes just to happiness between say education, income, and work. But what's also clear from this particular slide is that your marital status is a much better predictor, is more strongly associated with happiness than is your education and your income. And then when you kind of think about this even more deeply and look at the impact of having a very happy marriage on your odds of being very happy in life, there's a very strong association between being happy in your marriage and being happy globally. And this is, again, not rocket science for any of us, right? We all know this at some level. But I'm just saying that given this kind of pattern in the data, it's just striking that we focus so much of our attention, so much of our advice on, again, for our teenagers and young adults, on their schooling and their work, to the exclusion of preparing them for a good family future, a good marital future. Okay. So what I'm suggesting to you this morning is that our universities, our colleges, even our churches and our society have often failed in organizing the task of courtship. And classically, historically, courtship was a system of rules, common practices, and roles that would help guide young people into marriage. So when it comes to courtship and dating, I think young women and men in the country are often clueless and confused. And why is it that I'm arguing or suggesting today that sort of the end of all this is marriage? Well, it's because marriage is the institution, of course, that virtually every culture has used to ensure that children get the emotional, the material, the social, and the spiritual support of their mother and father, and that men and women have an opportunity to order their desires for emotional, sexual, social, and material care and cooperation. Or kind of more simply speaking, marriage is about bonding and it's about babies. Two very important things for, for our society. So given the fact that we have really, as a society, ceased to organize or guide young adults through kind of the dating and mating process with a view towards marriage, I'm going to offer a few do's and a few don'ts today that I think will be helpful if you are yourself a young adult looking to get married, or if you're working with young adults, or preaching and teaching about relationships and marriage today in our culture. The first question I just want to ask everyone in the audience, would you want to do something that would increase your risk of divorce, conflict, and marital unhappiness? Any takers out there? And of course, probably this audience knows that what's interesting here is that the research suggests that there's a link between increased divorce, less commitment, more conflict, and less happiness in marriage for couples who have cohabited. Now, it's important for me to be very sort of clear about the nature of this research, today. And what we're seeing today is that sort of clear link between cohabitation and divorce is being called more into question. But I think it's not because cohabitation is maybe kind of functioning better, so to speak. I think because there's so much other things happening now for young adults today when it comes to their life prior to marriage. So for some couples, I think today, cohabitation can actually be a relatively kind of responsible and stable option compared to everything else that might be in their social environment. But what's important to note here in terms of this issue of cohabitation and marital stability and marital quality is that what we're seeing from the work of Scott Stanley at the University of Denver and his colleagues is that cohabiting before an engagement is still a clear risk factor for marital unhappiness and divorce. He talks about how a lot of young adults today are kind of sliding into different stages in their relationship. They might be, they might hook up, then start to date, then live together on the weekends, then a couple nights a week, and then live together kind of on a more full-time basis. And they've never really had a kind of a clear conversation about shared goals, shared interests, and a shared future together. And again, they're kind of just sliding through these different stages. And it's those couples who are the most risk for both divorce and marital unhappiness. So let me talk about kind of one kind of example of this. And this comes again from work done by Scott Stanley and Galena Rhodes at the University of Denver for a report that the National Marriage Project produced last year called Before I Do. And in this report, they found that couples who had cohabited prior to either engagement or a wedding were more likely to be less happy in their marriages compared to couples who had not done this thing. So basically the point that they're making is that cohabiting without commitment to a future together is linked to worse outcomes in your marriage later on. Another issue too that comes out in the research is that having kind of more experience with multiple partnerships isn't very helpful. And of course in most domains in life, if you're a teacher, if you're an auto mechanic, if you're a financial analyst, generally speaking, more experience is a good thing. It kind of gives you some wisdom that you can apply, in the future. That basic pattern does not apply to serious intimate relationships. Okay, what we see is that people have more experience with intimate partners, generally speaking, have less happiness in their marriages and less stability. We see this with divorce, for instance, here. Women who have cohabited with 2 or more partners prior to marriage are about 130% more likely to get divorced compared to women who had cohabited with only their future spouse. And in terms of the issue of experience and marital happiness, what Galena Rhodes and Scott Stanley found was that women who'd had sex only with their spouse were more likely to report that they were happy in their marriages compared to women who had sex with 2 or more partners prior to marriage. Okay, so again, less experience when it comes to serious intimacy prior to marriage seems to be linked to better outcomes, particularly in this case for women. And why is this? Why is it that there's a link here between multiple relationships and lower odds of marital success? And I think some people would want to talk about selection effects. And that's the types of people, the types of men and women who've had lots of relationships may have kind of an underlying emotional vulnerability, towards depression, for instance, or something else that makes them more vulnerable to falling into that kind of pattern. And that I think could be and is part of the story. But it's also the case too that just having that experience of multiple relationships might have kind of an independent effect on your odds of success. It might give you more emotional baggage that you bring into your marriage, for instance. It might be associated with kind of habituated behavior, that when things get difficult, in a serious romantic relationship, you have a habit of breaking things off and looking for someone else. And of course, if that's your habituated pattern, when you get married, that's going to be obviously challenging, because all of us in our marriages, those of us who are married, will face difficult moments or periods in our family life or in our married life or in our life more generally. And then a third point is that people who've had multiple relationships, serious relationships prior to marriage, may have kind of developed a habit of comparing, or may develop a habit of comparing their spouse to different partners in their past. And of course, let's say your husband may not have been as funny as Ralph, or as handsome as Adam, or as ambitious as David. And of course, it's not fair to him because he's being compared on different fronts to different, previous boyfriends potentially. So these are sort of speculative reasons, but there's basically a connection again between more experience with lots of partners in the past and doing worse, in your marriage going forward. So these are things that I think have obvious implications for, for efforts to help young adults navigate the contemporary relational world. Another related point here is that we're seeing more evidence that the young adults moving towards marriage should take it slow. That's important to kind of establish a foundation of communication, trust, and emotional security before you give yourself to someone, not just physically but emotionally, okay? So, you want to make sure that you have these common, commitments, these common goals, these common interests, these common habits or hobbies that will, serve you well down the road. And unfortunately, a lot of young adults today, again, are just sort of sliding quickly through the stages of intimacy without really establishing this foundation of communication, trust, and security. And so we see, for instance, that people who did not begin their relationship with a hookup are more likely to report that they're very happy in their marriage, as the slide here suggests from the report Before I Do. We also see from some work done by Jason Carroll that the longer couples postpone sex in their relationship, the more likely they report higher marital quality. And you can see here on this slide that sort of waiting until marriage was linked to the highest levels of perceived stability, sexual quality, communication, and satisfaction in their marriages in this particular research. Now another point, and I think a point that's in some ways pretty countercultural across the board, in our society today, even in audiences like this one, I would suspect, is that the evidence suggests that young adults shouldn't necessarily put off marriage too long. And it is the case that kind of waiting until your mid to late 20s reduces your odds of divorce on average. But some new work done by a colleague of mine, Nicholas Wolfinger, finds that couples who kind of get married in their mid to late 30s or beyond that actually do experience a higher risk of divorce compared to those who get married in their late 20s and early 30s. So that's one point. The point I want to make is a little bit different here, and that is that when you look at marital quality, that is your odds of reporting that you're very happy in your marriage, for instance. What we seem to see in the research is that those who get married in their mid-20s tend to do best. And why is this? Well, I think one reason is that on the one hand, they're mature enough to move ahead with marriage, but on the other hand, they're not too settled, into their ways as a bachelor or bachelorette, to have difficulty kind of really establishing a shared way of life together. It's also the case, too, that they may not have had as much of an opportunity to move in and out of a series of sexually intimate relationships. And then it's also important to note, too, from some work done by Naomi Riley, that couples who marry comparatively younger are more likely to marry within the faith, whereas couples who wait until their 30s or later are more likely to marry outside of the faith. So that, too, may be part of the story here. They're more likely to establish a common faith, and a set of traditions and practices that revolve around that to their benefit. So we see when it comes to marital happiness that women who marry in their mid-20s tend to report the most marital happiness compared to women who get married younger or later. Now again, people will get married at different ages depending upon when they actually meet someone who would be a good spouse. But I'm just saying, if for instance, you're 22 and you have found someone who seems to be a great potential spouse, even though your parents might be encouraging you to wait, what I would say is there may be reasons for thinking about moving ahead with marriage to that person in the next year or two. Another point, and this in some ways I think is an obvious point, but I think, again, given my life experience, I'm 44. Unfortunately, I know people, including people who, went to good, in this case, evangelical colleges, who, got married in their early 20s to someone that they were really attracted to. But if you look clearly at them, you can see there really wasn't much in common. They didn't really establish a friendship that was based on something besides that physical attraction. And that reality proved to be a real big problem for them later on in their married and family life. So my point here simply is that when you're thinking about marriage, it's important to have what sociologists would call homogamy, where couples have similar interests and similar values and sustain a marital friendship over the long term, recognizing that kind of that initial rush of physical attraction will tend to kind of settle down in most relationships over time. So you need something that's going to sustain you and will basically give you an opportunity when you're sort of old and wrinkly and maybe less attractive. You're going to enjoy sitting on the front porch or the back patio, as it's now the case, and having a long conversation. So that's important to think about when you're thinking about marriage. And then some warning signs too. This comes from John Gottman, a psychologist at the University of Washington. And again, a lot of stuff seems just like completely commonsensical, but as someone who, again, is 44, I've now seen plenty of couples where this, they're not kind of heeding this kind of advice. So he says, for instance, don't get serious with someone who's stonewalling. And of course, which sex is more likely to stonewall? Men, right? So if you've got a partner who retreats in the face of a challenge or a conflict or a request for change, and I'm not saying like, a lot of us guys, it'll take us an hour or 5 or a day or 2 to kind of respond in an appropriately positive way. But the good ones, do respond and do handle these things at some point in the relatively near future when something is raised, okay? And don't kind of just shut down in the face of any kind of difficulty or conflict, okay? So that's one thing. Don't get serious with a stonewaller. A second point is avoid a partner who nags, That's gotta be women. So it's true that on average women are more likely to say things like you never or you always, and if this is a kind of pervasive pattern in the relationship, that's also a warning sign, according to John Gottman's research. And then a final point again is that you should look for a partner with whom you have many more positive interactions than negative ones. And you would say, a lot of you would say, well, duh, right? But again, now that I look at some of my friends over my life, I had a friend who was a professor, good guy, and he was dating someone who was also a professor. She seemed very, nice in public, but in private she was very, very negative, very critical, and I would say the bulk of their private relationship was negative. And it took them just months to kind of, step aside from this relationship. So I think, to be kind of attentive to these things, which are very good predictors both of poor mental quality and also divorce down the road. On a more positive note, I think thinking about commitment, and really in two ways. One is this person, putting my welfare above that of his or her friends, his or her colleagues at work? Is it clearly the case that I'm sort of the number one person as you get more and more serious in that person's life? You're looking for that kind of individual commitment to you and the relationship. That's an important, obviously, predictor of future success in a marriage. But it's also the case, too, does this person have kind of an institutionalized model of commitment? Is this person likely to embrace an ethic of till death do us part when it comes to marriage? So what we know is that couples who share that commitment to lifelong marriage, net of all this other stuff, are more likely to invest in one another financially, emotionally, and socially than couples who don't. And it also looks like having this commitment from the guy is particularly important in predicting future success. So making sure that he is really darn committed to you is a great predictor of future marital success, according to work done by Scott Stanley at the University of... We'll talk about why that is in the Q&A, I think. Then a point, too, about kind of virtues. It's easy when you are dating, going to restaurants, movies, or hikes in the Blue Ridge Mountains to kind of put on a good front, But you want to basically have opportunities where your your partner is being tested. Maybe it's working for, 5 hours at a Habitat for Humanity site, or you have a chance to sort of see your spouse under pressure at work or at school. Sorry, your partner again. And you want to basically be able to see, does this partner have the virtues like thrift, fortitude, wisdom, loyalty, and charity that would make them a good spouse down the road? Not just are they attractive, not just are they pleasant to be around, but do they have these sort of virtues that will sustain them in more challenging times? And this also relates to another point, and that is, what do your friends and family think about the person that you are dating? And the fact of the matter is they often have more perspective on that person than you do. It's also the case, too, that if they're in your court once you get married, you're going to flourish a lot more than if they're not in your court, if they don't have much respect for your partner. So attend, when you're dating someone, attend to the advice, the feedback of friends or family members who you think are wise, because they'll often have a perspective on you and your relationship that you don't. And this leads to actually another finding from Before I Do. And it's what we see is that couples who have bigger marriages, or bigger weddings, I should say, are more likely to report that they're happy a few years later in the marriage. This is not about spending a lot of money, just about basically, there's something about, we don't know what the exact sort of mechanism here is, but there's something about having a big, wedding where there are lots of friends and family members who are gathered there for that celebration that's linked to better outcomes. It may be that you take your vows more seriously with a big group, or it could also be that you just have a big network to support you in your marriage. Then the role of faith. And a lot of obvious points that I can make about faith here, but what I want to sort of stress here is something that's a little bit maybe different than what you might expect. And that is that I think a lot of young adults today have a kind of a soulmate model of married life, a more romantic model of married life, where they're kind of expecting in some way for their spouse, their marriage to complete them. Of course, we know in the real world that puts a heavy burden on the relationship. And in the real world, no relationship and no person is capable of making us ultimately happy, ultimately complete in this life. So the idea here is that couples who focus on something larger than themselves, like their faith, for instance, are paradoxically more likely to enjoy marital happiness and more stability. I think that's in part because their relationship doesn't have to meet unrealistic expectations. And it's also, I think, the case that they're more likely to see their marriage as an opportunity to serve someone else, to be generous towards someone else, rather than to have their own needs and desires met. And we see in the research that couples who get married in some kind of formal setting, usually in a church setting, are more likely to report happier marriages than those who get married before the justice of the peace. I've also mentioned too about Scott Stanley's work in terms of deciding, not sliding. And I think one of the things that comes out of his work is this idea of it's important for couples to sort of talk with one another about their future together and to be decisive about how they're going to organize their friendships, their in-laws, their faith, work and family before the wedding day. And one of the things that we see in the research, and I think it's congruent with this basic idea, is we have to be decisive together as a couple. Don't just sort of slide through these major, decisions or whatnot. Is that couples who have some kind of premarital preparation, usually in a religious context, are more likely to flourish than couples who don't have it. So if you're trying to sell pre-Cana, for instance, this research is very consistent with the idea that it helps. And I think one reason it helps is it's really particularly giving couples experience with talking through difficult or important things in their future, particularly the guys, frankly. So when Daniel and I got engaged, for instance, and we went to our pre-Cana in the Arlington diocese, a few years ago, what we found is that we basically failed in every single topic except for a shared faith. So there was a lot of fruitful conversations that flowed from that experience of having a pre-Cana and really talking through some issues, and getting some agreement that we hadn't really, bothered to do, prior to that experience. Okay, before I conclude, let me just say a few things about marriage. So once you've crossed the threshold, if you will, into married life, a few do's and don'ts before I conclude. So one thing is, again, we live in a culture that's much more egalitarian today than it was, 50, 100, 200 years ago. In many ways, it's a good thing. But I think one thing we have to avoid is what I would call kind of the 50-50 trap. It's that we have to split everything in our marriage and family life on a 50-50 basis. And I know a couple, for instance, at UVA, where they had a chart on their refrigerator. Not for their kids. We have those for our kids. But for one another. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's just must so debilitating to see how you're measuring up with your spouse in terms of doing this and that around the house. So keeping score isn't very helpful for a marriage. I think more importantly, spouses tend to have different strengths, and you should try to align responsibilities in line with those strengths. And also the point is that I think it undercuts an ethic of mutual dependency. I mean, there are things that Danielle does that I could never do, and vice versa. So you should kind of build on your strengths, cultivate mutual dependency in your marriage. That's all to the good. But having said that, it's important, again, particularly today, to cultivate an ethic of equity. Particularly, women are more likely than men to report that their marriages are unfair. So I think particularly husbands need to be attentive to this reality and figure out, are there ways in which I can be more flexible, more responsive to the needs of the family and the home in ways that will make my wife and my kids happier. So again, when women are, unfortunately, a minority report their marriages are unfair, but when they do report that they're unfair, that's associated with a lot of bad outcomes for marriages. Another point in terms of once you've crossed the threshold into marriage is be careful about your boundaries with the opposite sex. And of course, again, we live in a culture that doesn't really talk about this issue publicly much anymore. And we tend to be pretty casual in how we approach workplace relationships and whatnot. But all I'm saying is that when you socialize, particularly when you travel away from your family, when you work closely with members of the opposite sex, there should be an ethic of prudence, that you're not being too intimate with someone at work, particularly when things are difficult in your marriage. This is going to be helpful in maintaining the vitality, the strength, and stability of your marriage over the long term. And then for men in particular, you need to sort of have the same attitude towards the virtual world. And obviously pornography is a big deal for a lot of people today, particularly men. And we know it's linked. There's big debates about the causality here, but it's certainly linked to less marital happiness, more infidelity, and more divorce. So again, the idea is that we should really, in a more positive way, kind of think about channeling our attentions and our affections and our time on our spouse and not upon others, either in the real world or in the virtual world. And in terms of, it's also the case too that marriage is a much more expressive institution, much more emotional institution today than it was, say, 100 or 200 years ago. And given all that, I think men need to do more than they might be naturally inclined to when it comes to being affectionate, empathetic, and understanding with their spouse. To sort of continue to work at that, obviously, a lot. After the wedding day. It's fairly easy before the wedding day, but after the wedding day, it can be, I think, more challenging for men. At the same time, though, I think women have to recognize that the average husband is not going to be maybe as emotionally expressive as their best girlfriend, their mother, or their sister. So, given that, it's important for women to cultivate female friendships that will give them that kind of, relationship in ways that will kind of, divvy up the emotional load in their lives in helpful ways too. It's also the case too that women and men, again, on average, they're different. We all know there are exceptions to this basic idea, but they tend to relate in some different ways. And I think a challenge today is that we don't necessarily acknowledge that in our public culture. In the academy and the media in particular. And yet it still is the case that, for instance, again, in the face of some kind of difficulty, men are more likely to withdraw. And women are more likely to want to talk about it. So, for instance, Daniel and I, when we were first married, we'd face a difficult, so I was maybe writing a book chapter or something, and I would kind of just become quiet and withdraw a little bit. And she'd be asking me about it. I didn't want to talk about it, I just wanted to get it done. So there's some tension around that. And likewise, she was teaching and might have had difficulty with some of her students. And I would say, well, you need to do this, that, and that with those students. And she didn't want me to do that at all. She wanted me to just be empathetic. Oh, that sounds really hard, Danielle. Gosh, wow, it's really challenging. So it took us a while to kind of understand that how we dealt with difficulties and challenges was somewhat different. And to kind of recognize that, appreciate that, celebrate it, make fun of it, that was the way to handle these differences. And I think, appreciating those differences can be helpful too in today's marriages. Now, just a few more slides, we're almost done here. when it comes to marriage, it's also the case too that, again, on the religious point, that women and men who attend church together are more likely to succeed in their marriages. They're less likely to get divorced, as this slide here suggests. They're also more likely to enjoy high levels of marital equality. What I found is that the reports of God being at the center of one's marriage is a better predictor than attendance for American couples. And I think it's just this idea that they're cultivating a prayer life, a spiritual life that integrates their marriage with their faith. And that, not surprisingly, is linked to some great outcomes. It's also the case, too, that, when it comes to marriage and family life, stresses, the loss of a job, the loss of a parent, a child who's extraordinarily difficult, these stresses can just break apart a family, can break apart a marriage. So I think one of the ways in which faith can be helpful here too is that both in terms of prayer can be a way of dealing with stress, and having the support of friends from a congregation or a church can be really helpful in helping couples navigate the stresses that that affect all of us. So we see, for instance, to give you kind of a more concrete, more recent bit of data, that among younger adults who are getting married comparatively young today in the United States, that those who are attending, that's the blue line here in this graph up on the screen, are less likely to get divorced than those who are not regularly attending, that's in red. And in terms of Catholic stories, particularly powerful here, that young adults who are Catholic, who are getting married comparatively young, but who are attending services or Mass, are much less likely to get divorced than their other peers who are getting married younger. So that's just one kind of empirical illustration of the way in which religious faith remains a source of, in this case, stability in today's world. So again, just to wrap up here, I would suggest to you today that marriage is a daring and even dangerous adventure. It can be particularly challenging because we don't have institutionalized rules to guide us through both kind of the courtship phase and then also married life more generally. The kinds of rules that I've talked about today I think should be helpful. And again, what I would say is the bottom line here is that this adventure is best undertaken in a community of friends and family members that honor and value your marriage. And again, this sort of paradox of contemporary marital happiness is that this happiness is most likely to be found by seeing your marriage as an opportunity to make a gift of oneself to one's spouse, to one's kids, and for those who are believers, to one's God. So thank you very much.